It was Saturday evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a dim twilight that blurred the line between night and day. Jason Holt didn't need to worry about switching on his headlights. He was already pulling into the garage of his house on a quiet street in Millhaven. Moments later, a lean, dark-haired man stepped out of the car, gathering a duffel bag, briefcase, and laptop. Years of routine made handling the load effortless. Jason entered the house without calling out to his wife, Claire. He knew she wasn't home. Moving through the living room, he placed the briefcase and laptop on the couch and propped his garment bag at the base of the stairs. After hanging his coat in the front closet, he loosened his tie, slipped off his jacket, and unbuttoned the top of his shirt. Jason had just returned from a regional conference of managers at Zenith Dynamics. Though not officially a manager, his role as lead systems analyst often placed him in high-level meetings. His supervisor, who excelled at managing people but lacked technical expertise, had insisted on Jason's presence at the Cleveland meeting. To avoid suspicion, Jason had told Claire he'd be back Monday, explaining the conference would be followed by weekend seminars. He had his reasons for lying and didn't want to come home too soon. He regretted not packing more casual clothes. Claire would have questioned why he brought them. Now back, he headed straight for the shower and changed into jeans and a polo shirt. After a quick meal of leftovers and a bottle of beer, he sat in the living room, flipping through the local newspaper. He looked like any husband unwinding after a trip. But in reality, Jason was wrestling with a personal crisis. He'd moved past denial, but anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance loomed over him like storm clouds. By midnight, he found himself cleaning the kitchen, more to avoid his thoughts than out of necessity. With no other distractions left, he put on a light jacket and went to the side door. Just as he was about to leave, he remembered something, returned to the living room, and sent an email from his laptop. 5 minutes later, he was in the car, pulling out of the garage. The door closed automatically behind him as he drove into the night. At 7:37 a.m., Millhaven's emergency dispatch received a call. Emergency? What's your emergency? A young woman's voice came through, shaky but composed. I need the police. I think something bad has happened. Where are you located, ma'am? The operator asked. I'm at a payphone on Lakeside Drive, near Jefferson Park, she replied. The operator, noting the static on the line, continued, What kind of incident? Were you attacked or robbed? The woman hesitated. No, it's not me. I was jogging through the park near the picnic area and saw a car. Its doors were open, the lights were on, and there was blood. A lot of it. The operator's tone sharpened. Do you see anyone injured? Should we send an ambulance? No, no one was there. I didn't look around much. I was scared someone might still be there, so I ran to this payphone to call you. You did the right thing, the operator reassured her. Officers will be there in less than 10 minutes. Can you wait to guide them to the exact location? No, I'm not staying, the woman said, her voice rising. What if someone comes after me? I'm going home. The line went dead before the operator could respond. The dispatcher sighed, staring at the screen. Great, she muttered. Let's hope this wasn't a false alarm. By mid-afternoon, Detective Paul Renner arrived at the Holt residence. A blonde woman had just pulled into the driveway as he stepped out of his unmarked car. He quickly approached her. Excuse me, I'm looking for Mrs. Holt. The woman turned, hauling a suitcase from the car. I'm Claire Holt. Who are you? Detective Paul Renner, Millhaven Police. We're trying to locate your husband, Jason Holt. His car was found abandoned in Jefferson Park this morning. He held up his badge. Claire's brow furrowed. That can't be right. Jason is in Cleveland. He always parks at the airport when he travels. You must be mistaken. Renner shook his head. We're certain it's his car. The plates and VIN matched the registration. Claire looked unsettled but firm. If that's true, then it must have been stolen. I don't know what else to tell you. When did you last speak to your husband? Renner asked. Could you call him to confirm he's in Cleveland? Does he have a cell phone? Claire set down her suitcase and rummaged through her purse. He called yesterday morning. I'll try him now. She dialed Jason's number, but the sound of a ringtone came from Renner's pocket. He pulled out a phone and answered, Mrs. Holt. Claire's eyes widened. How do you have Jason's phone? It was found in his car, Renner explained. I'm sorry, but I can't give it back. It's evidence in what may be a major crime. Claire's face paled. Major crime? What do you mean? Your husband's car was found with its doors open, lights on, and a bullet hole in the windshield. We need to locate him immediately to determine if he's a victim or a suspect. Can you call his hotel in Cleveland? Claire picked up her phone book and said, Sure. The hotel number is in my address book. Jason always stays at the same Holiday Inn. Come inside, and we'll sort this out. Inside the kitchen, she quickly found the number and called the hotel. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned to Detective Renner, her face pale. Jason's briefcase and laptop are in the living room. I don't understand. The detective, his expression thoughtful, dialed his phone. Hi, Alex, it's Paul. I need a search warrant for the Holt house. We need to determine if Mr. Holt is a victim or a suspect. Bring it here ASAP, I'll be waiting. He hung up and sat down across from Claire. A search warrant? You can look wherever you want. Just ask, I need you to find my husband, Claire said, her voice rising. Renner replied calmly, I understand, but I have to follow protocol. If your husband is involved in anything illegal, any evidence found without a warrant can't be used in court. Illegal? Jason isn't involved in anything illegal. Claire shot back, anger flaring. He works with computers. Renner leaned forward. Then why did he come back to town without telling you? Claire's face fell. Her hands trembled slightly as she whispered, Oh no, he can't be, she trailed off, then stammered, I have no idea why he came home early. All I know is that Jason isn't involved in anything criminal. Her panic grew as she added, he could be hurt somewhere. You have to find him. Renner softened his tone. We don't know anything for sure yet, Mrs. Holt. I promise, all our officers are working to find your husband. Why don't you make some coffee while we wait for the warrant? Claire nodded reluctantly and began making coffee. Renner watched her closely. Once the coffee was ready, they sat at the kitchen table. While we have coffee, Renner began, I'd like you to tell me how you've spent the last 48 hours. We need statements from everyone involved. Claire nodded again, clutching her mug. As she recounted her weekend, Renner carefully jotted down notes. She described the condition of Jason's car, as Renner explained it, doors open, a bullet hole in the windshield, and traces of blood. He added that forensic investigators believed a second bullet had struck a body, which was found on nearby firewood. The car had been towed for further analysis, and both the medical examiner and forensic teams were still processing the scene. Detective Alex Quinn arrived shortly after, warrant in hand, accompanied by 2 forensic technicians. They began a detailed search of the house, garage, and vehicles. Renner coordinated with Claire to collect Jason's razor and toothbrush for DNA comparison. Claire, now visibly distressed, was asked to sit on the couch while the team worked. After about an hour, the team gathered Jason's briefcase, laptop, and DNA samples. The laptop was password protected. Mrs. Holt, do you know your husband's laptop password? Renner asked. Claire, eager to help, replied, it used to be his first and last name with his birth year, Jason Holt 1976. Try that. When none of the variations worked, Renner reassured her. Don't worry. Our technicians will figure it out. The evidence was packed into the forensic van, and Renner returned to the kitchen to get Claire's preliminary statement. So, Mrs. Holt, he began, let's start with Saturday morning. What were you doing? Claire took a deep breath and recounted, Saturday morning, I was doing chores around the house. Jason called from Cleveland around 1 or 1:30, apologizing for not being home. I went shopping after that, got back around 4:30, and had dinner. At about 7:30, I went to my friend Amanda's house and stayed the night. This morning, I slept in, took my time getting ready, and got home around 2 p.m. As she spoke, her gaze drifted to the floor, and she clenched her fists, her anxiety evident. Renner finished his notes and pocketed his notebook. This is good for now, Mrs. Holt. We might need more details later, so please stay available. Before stepping away, Renner asked, do you have any recent, full-length photos of your husband? A headshot would also help. Right now, we only have his driver's license photo. Claire nodded and retrieved a photo album from the bookshelf. Together, they selected a group photo and a close-up of Jason. As Renner studied the photos, he pointed to another man. Is this a relative? If we can't use the razor or toothbrush, we might need DNA from a family member. Claire shook her head. That's Ben Carter, Jason's best friend since high school. Jason doesn't have any close relatives nearby. Renner thanked her and rejoined his colleagues in the garage. Forensics had discovered faint bloodstains on the gas and brake pedals of Claire's car, prompting them to tow it for further inspection. As the technicians packed their gear, Renner and Quinn reviewed their findings, exchanging theories about the case. For now, the mystery of Jason Holt's disappearance, and his unexpected return to Millhaven, remained unsolved. Renner, standing by the side door, turned to his partner. What's your take on Mrs. Holt? He asked. I have my doubts, especially with the blood in her car. Quinn shrugged. She seems like a worried wife, but it's hard to tell at this stage. We shouldn't make any assumptions yet. Renner nodded. Let's see how she reacts when we tell her about the blood and towing her car. The two detectives re-entered the kitchen, catching Claire mid-conversation on her cell phone. She quickly ended the call, looking startled. You're back. I thought you were done, she said, her voice tense. Renner got straight to the point. We found blood smears on the pedals of your car. We're towing it for a full inspection. I hope you don't mind. Claire's face went pale. Blood? In my car? I didn't see any blood. Renner replied evenly, we'll need to figure out how it got there. If it's connected to the incident at the park, we'll need answers. Also, we'll need the shoes you wore today. Claire stammered, I haven't been to the park in weeks. I have no idea how there could be blood in my car. She removed her shoes and handed them over before collapsing into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook as she began to sob. The detectives exchanged a glance. They knew they needed more information before drawing any conclusions. Renner handed the shoes to Quinn, and they stepped outside. What's your take, Paul? Quinn asked. Is she just a worried wife, or is she acting? Renner frowned. I don't know. Did you notice how quickly she hung up that call? Could have been important. She might have been talking to someone who knows more than she's letting on. Let's dig around. We need to talk to her neighbors and friends, maybe they know something. Quinn nodded. I'd bet that call was to her best friend. Probably, Renner agreed. And we need to figure out why Jason came back early. That's the piece we're missing. They drove back to the station separately, each turning over the scattered clues in their minds. The rest of the evening was spent on reports and preliminary analysis of the evidence. The following morning, Renner and Quinn arrived at the precinct early. Forensic reports and the medical examiner's findings were waiting for them. They spent the first hour reviewing the documents. Renner closed the folder with a sigh. The evidence seems to point in the same direction, but let's not rush. We need more from his computer and his contacts. Quinn agreed. Let's visit Jason's lawyer and colleagues today. Maybe they can shed some light. Their first stop was Jason's lawyer, Robert Graham, who greeted them briskly in his office. I don't usually discuss my clients' cases, detectives. What do you need? Renner handed over a few printed emails. These were sent from Jason Holt's computer. We need to confirm they weren't just drafts. Graham glanced over the pages and nodded. These are legitimate. I received these emails directly from Jason. The detectives thanked him and left the office. On their way to Zenith Dynamics, Quinn said, "You know, the spouse is usually involved in cases like this, but Claire seems genuinely shaken. I think there's more to Jason's disappearance than a domestic issue." Renner nodded thoughtfully. Agreed. But we still need to figure out why he lied about staying in Cleveland all weekend. At Jason's workplace, the detectives were ushered into the office of his supervisor, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor. "We're investigating Jason Holt's car being found abandoned in Jefferson Park," Quinn began. "You might have heard about it. We have a few questions." The supervisor nodded. "Jason's a great employee. I'll help however I can." "Was Jason scheduled to be in Cleveland through the weekend?" Renner asked. "He told his wife he had seminars on Saturday and Sunday." The supervisor frowned. "No, there were no seminars scheduled. I expected him back on Friday night." Quinn made a note. "Has Jason been acting differently lately? Anything unusual on his mind?" After a moment's thought, the supervisor replied, "He seemed distracted lately. I even asked if everything was okay, but he brushed it off and said he was fine. Honestly, I assumed he was just under a lot of pressure." The detectives thanked him and returned to their car, feeling like they were making progress. By midday, the detectives were back at the station, reviewing the preliminary DNA results and a forensic report. Among the evidence was a small, strange box with wires protruding from it, which had been found in Jason's car. Renner tapped the report. "This box could be a critical piece. Let's focus on it while we wait for full lab results. Also, I think it's time we visit Claire again, this time, unannounced." Arriving at the Holt residence around 3 p.m., they knocked on the door. Claire answered, looking surprised. "Detectives. Have you found Jason?" she asked, her tone anxious. "I've been calling the station every 2 hours, but they have no updates." Renner shook his head. "Not yet, Mrs. Holt, but we've made some progress. We'd like to ask you a few more questions." Claire hesitated, then stepped aside. "Sure, come in. I'll do my best to help." They sat in the living room. Renner wasted no time. "Mrs. Holt, is there anything you want to tell us about your relationship with Ben Carter?" Claire went pale. "What? Ben? He's Jason's best friend." "He's just a friend." Quinn leaned forward. "Are you having an affair with Ben Carter?" Claire's face turned ashen. Her voice shook as she stammered, "Absolutely not. How can you even ask me that?" Renner stood, his expression neutral. "We'll need you to come down to the station to provide a formal statement." Claire panicked. "What? Am I under arrest? Why do I have to go to the station?" "You're not under arrest, yet," Detective Quinn replied. "We need an official statement. You have the right to bring a lawyer if you want." Claire shook her head. "I don't need a lawyer. I'll come to the station. I'll do whatever it takes to help find Jason." She followed the detectives out, escorting them to their car. At the station, they led her to a dimly lit interrogation room designed to create unease. Quinn gestured to the seat. "Please wait here while we gather our documents," he said. Are you sure you don't want a lawyer? I'm sure, Claire replied, her voice firm though her eyes were wet with unshed tears. She slumped into the chair, and Quinn stepped out, ensuring the room's cameras were active. In the hallway, Renner turned to their supervisor. Make sure we get a clear recording of everything. I have a feeling we're close to breaking this case. Renner and Quinn decided to give Claire a few minutes alone to reflect. They grabbed coffee in the station's break room and discussed their strategy for the interrogation. Meanwhile, across town, a Crime Stoppers volunteer answered a call. Good morning, this is Crime Stoppers. We offer rewards of up to $1,000 for information on solved crimes. This call is being recorded. What do you have for us? After a brief silence, an older man's hesitant voice came through. Can I really get money if I help the police? That depends on the quality of your tip and how much it helps. Do you have information about a crime? Another pause. Do I get the money right away? What if the police try to trick me? The reward doesn't come from the police, so they won't scam you. Share your information, and I'll give you a code number. You can check back in a few days to see if your tip helped. There was a sigh on the other end before the man said, I need the money now. I need juice. Juice? The volunteer was caught off guard. Yeah, the fancy kind. Costs $5 a bottle. The volunteer smiled but kept her tone professional. If your tip is good, you could buy a lot of juice. What do you know? Fine. I saw someone throw a weapon into the river under the 6th Street Bridge. This was Sunday morning. He had a rifle and 2 shovels. Was this on the east side of the bridge? Did he throw them in the water? Yes, he tossed them off the dock. I can describe him. He was a big guy, blonde. Did you see the car he was driving? It was dark blue. The license plate started with A's SS, but I don't remember the rest. The volunteer noted the details. Thank you. Your tip has been recorded, and your code number is 127. Call back in a few days to check on the reward. The information was immediately relayed to the police liaison, and a diver was dispatched. Within an hour, the team retrieved a rifle and 2 shovels from the riverbed. Ballistics confirmed the rifle matched the weapon used in the George Washington Park shooting. The detectives were alerted. As Renner and Quinn left the break room, a clerk intercepted them with new reports. Detectives, we have the weapon used in the park incident. The attached report might lead us to the suspect. Renner took the files, skimming through them. Good work, he said. Turning to Quinn, he added, let's split up. You handle Claire, I'll have a uniformed officer bring Blake Carter in for questioning. Quinn nodded. Sounds like a plan. Things are coming together. Back in the interrogation room, Claire sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly on the table. She looked up as Quinn entered with a folder. Sorry to keep you waiting, Mrs. Holt. This room is monitored and recorded, he explained. That's fine, Claire said, her voice steady. I have nothing to hide. Quinn wasted no time. Let's start with a simple question. Are you having an affair with Blake Carter? Claire's shoulders slumped, and she looked away. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Quinn pulled out papers from the folder. We have proof of your affair. Jason knew about it. He sent these emails to his attorney, planning to file for divorce on grounds of infidelity. He slid a map across the table. This map shows your visits to Blake Carter's house. Claire's face contorted in shock. How did Jason know? Quinn held up a small device. He installed a tracker in your car. He's been monitoring your location in real time. Claire stared at the device, her voice breaking. Jason knew for weeks. And he wanted a divorce? Tears streamed down her face. Quinn pressed on. Jason documented your visits with Blake. The last entry on this map is from Saturday night, the night he went missing. He emailed his lawyer, saying he planned to confront you and feared the situation might escalate. But Jason never showed up at Blake's house. Claire exclaimed. I was there all night. Quinn leaned forward, his voice low and firm. Preliminary DNA results show the blood found at the park belongs to Jason. The weapon we recovered has been linked to Blake Carter. Now, the question is, how long are you going to cover for him? Claire's breath hitched. Blake didn't do anything to Jason. We were together all night. Quinn's expression didn't waver. The evidence says otherwise, Mrs. Holt. If you want to help Jason, now's the time to start telling the truth. Klein folded his arms, leaning back in his chair. We also found your husband's blood in your car and on your shoes, he said, his tone sharp. My partner is bringing in Mr. Carter right now. Whoever tells us the truth about what happened to Jason, and where to find his body, will get a better deal. Claire's face went pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. She stared down at the papers Klein handed her, barely glancing at them before breaking into sobs. Jason can't be dead, she whispered, her voice trembling. I love him, I need him. Tears streamed down her face. Blake will tell you the same thing. If Jason got hurt in the park, we had nothing to do with it. Klein watched her cry into her crumpled handkerchief, giving her a moment to compose herself. When her breathing steadied, he leaned forward, his voice firm but not unkind. Mrs. Holt, the evidence is clear. There's no doubt your husband is dead. The medical examiner says there's over a 95% chance, based on the amount of blood lost and the lack of any hospital treatment. Jason couldn't have survived. He placed crime scene photos in front of her. Blood-streaked grass, dark stains on firewood, and Jason's car with the bullet hole in the windshield. Claire's reaction was immediate, she sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking violently. Klein pushed the photos toward her. Take a good look. Denying what happened won't help you. I'll leave you alone for a few minutes to think, he added, standing up. If you want to help yourself, you need to start telling the truth. He stepped out of the room, shaking his head as he passed Renner in the hallway. She's a mess, but she's holding back. Let's see what Blake has to say. Across town, Renner arrived at Blake Carter's house with a patrol car. A moment after knocking, Blake opened the door, his face calm but wary. Yes, officers. How can I help you? I'm Detective Renner, here about Jason Holt's disappearance, he said, showing his badge. We need you to come to the station for questioning. Mrs. Holt is already there, and we have some questions you might help us answer. Am I under arrest? Blake asked, his voice hesitant. No, but we'd appreciate your cooperation. Blake sighed and nodded, too stunned to resist. He complied as they guided him into the unmarked car, sitting quietly in the back. On the way to the station, Renner asked, How well do you know Mrs. Holt? Blake's tone was guarded. She's Jason's wife. That's all. Renner raised an eyebrow. Just Jason's wife? Nothing more. Blake stiffened. Why are you asking me that? Renner shifted gears. What do you do for work, Mr. Carter? I own a landscaping business, Carter Landscaping. We handle commercial accounts, even some city projects, Blake replied, his voice relaxing slightly. At the station, Blake was placed in an interrogation room next to Claire's. Renner joined Klein, who had already gathered a stack of reports. Klein began questioning Blake, starting with the basics. At first, Blake denied any personal involvement with Claire. But when Klein presented emails, GPS data, and surveillance footage, Blake sighed in defeat. Fine, he admitted. Claire and I have been having an affair for a few months. But we didn't hurt Jason. We didn't even leave the house the night he disappeared. Klein didn't let up. If Jason found out about the affair, what do you think he'd do? Blake hesitated, then said, Jason had a temper. If he found out, maybe he went into a rage, or I don't know, maybe he hired someone to set us up. Renner folded his arms. We have the weapon used in Jason's murder. A witness described someone matching your description, driving a car like yours, dumping it in the river. Don't insult us with wild theories about Jason framing you. Blake's face turned red. You don't understand. Jason and I have history. We've been best friends since we were kids, but he's not the easiest person to get along with. Go on, Klein said. In high school, I dated one of his girlfriends behind his back, Blake confessed. When Jason found out, he scared the hell out of me, even though I'm bigger and stronger. He told me if I ever crossed him again, he'd liquidate me. I never forgot it. Renner raised an eyebrow. So you were scared of him, but you still had an affair with his wife. Blake's voice softened. I couldn't help myself. Claire and it built up over the years. A few months ago, I made a move, and things just happened. But we were careful. I can't believe Jason found out. Affairs often lead to murder, Klein said bluntly. I think you and Claire planned this together. If you confess now, you might get leniency. Blake's face twisted in anger. I didn't hurt Jason. Maybe Claire did something, but I don't know anything about it. Renner stood, gathering the reports. When two people are involved, one always tries to pin it on the other. You're not going anywhere, Mr. Carter. Outside the room, Klein handed Renner a new report. The shovels found in the river were purchased through Carter Landscaping. These two think they're smarter than us. The detectives reviewed the evidence and presented it to the district attorney. Despite Jason's body still being missing, the evidence, blood, the weapon, and the shovels, was overwhelming. Half an hour later, Claire Holt and Blake Carter were charged with Jason Holt's homicide. They both proclaimed their innocence as their Miranda rights were read. After their arraignment, Claire and Blake were fingerprinted and photographed, neither needing to be told not to smile. As they were led back to their cells, they spoke for the first time since being charged. What are we going to do, Blake? They can't really think we did anything to Jason, can they? Claire asked, her voice still shaking. Blake, equally frustrated, replied, we need lawyers, maybe the same one, to save money, since we're accused of the same thing. But this whole thing is wrong. I think Jason set us up. You can't believe that, can you? Why would Jason go to such extremes? Claire asked, her tone incredulous. Blake shook his head. I don't think you knew Jason as well as you thought. I'm surprised he didn't do something sooner. If I thought he'd ever find out, I wouldn't have touched you. Blake then shared a story about a time in high school when he secretly dated one of Jason's girlfriends. When Jason found out, he scared the hell out of me. Told me if I ever crossed him again, he'd make me regret it. Claire sighed. I just can't believe Jason would go this far. And I don't even know how he found out. We were careful, we only met when he was out of town. She hesitated before adding, I regret everything. Even if Jason isn't gone, I want a divorce. Blake's expression hardened. You knew what you were risking when you came to my house, Claire. You can't blame me for this. Claire lowered her voice, a hint of guilt creeping in. You're right. I just hope Jason can forgive me somehow. After a moment, Claire suggested calling Jason's attorney, Robert Graham, to represent them both. Blake agreed, and Claire signaled for an officer to request a call. However, Graham declined, citing his conflict of interest due to Jason's divorce proceedings. Instead, he recommended a colleague, Basil Smith. Smith arrived later that evening. A seasoned attorney with a sharp suit and sharper instincts, he wasted no time reviewing the situation. So, Smith began, glancing between them, you're both charged with Jason Holt's homicide. Let's start with what the detectives told you. Claire, why don't you go first? Claire recounted her side of the story, her voice trembling as she insisted, "I had nothing to do with it. I love Jason. I couldn't hurt him." Smith nodded and turned to Blake. "Your turn." Briefly. Blake summarized his account, ending with, "I think Jason planned this whole thing to frame us. He's always been capable of something like this." Smith leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "First things first, we need to focus on bail. It'll likely be set at $100,000 each. Can either of you manage that?" Claire's eyes widened. $100,000. "I don't have that kind of money." Smith reassured her. "You'll only need 10%, or $10,000, to post a bail bond." Blake nodded. "I can manage it with my business. I'll get it done." Claire, however, looked hesitant. Her savings were nearly depleted, and she didn't have sole ownership of her home. Reluctantly, she called her parents, who eventually agreed to help after much persuasion. The next morning, Claire and Blake appeared in court for their arraignment. Disheveled and tired, they entered pleas of not guilty. Bail was set at $100,000 each. By early afternoon, Blake had secured his release using his home as collateral. Claire, on the other hand, had to spend another night in jail, waiting for her parents to finalize the funds. Finally released the following evening, Claire returned home, exhausted. She ignored Blake's calls, showered, and collapsed into bed, her emotions overwhelming her. Over the next few weeks, Claire learned that Jason had drained their joint savings account before his disappearance. The money had been transferred to an unknown account, and divorce papers citing infidelity arrived shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, Basil Smith worked to build their defense. He argued the difficulty of securing a conviction without a body or a witness and suggested hiring a private investigator to explore the possibility that Jason had staged his disappearance. Blake agreed to the plan, but Claire believed Jason had been the victim of a carjacking gone wrong. Despite weeks of effort, the investigator found no solid leads. Attempts to trace the anonymous Crime Stoppers tip went nowhere, and the caller never followed up. Tensions between Claire and Blake grew. During one of their meetings with Smith, Blake suggested they resume their affair. "Are you out of your mind?" Claire snapped. "I've lost everything because of you. Don't ever bring that up again." Blake's expression darkened. "You were fine with it when Jason was out of town. Don't try to put this all on me. If it weren't for you, Jason never would have found out." Claire shot back. Smith raised his hands, his tone firm. "Enough. If you two want any chance of walking free, you need to stick together. The prosecution will use every bit of animosity between you against you." Both fell silent, glaring at each other across the table. As the trial approached, the weight of the evidence, Jason's blood in Claire's car, the shovels linked to Blake's business, and the recovered weapon, loomed heavily over them. Though both maintained their innocence, their defenses began to fracture under the strain. "I want nothing to do with you except for this court case," Claire said, often in tears. Blake's response was icy. "Suit yourself, Claire. You're not the only woman in town." From that point forward, they only spoke in the presence of their lawyer, Basil Smith, keeping their distance otherwise. Their once passionate affair had gone stone cold. A month after their release, Basil Smith arranged a meeting with District Attorney Jeff Bagden. Both Claire and Blake hoped the charges would be dropped, having grown tired of being interrogated about their relationship and harassed by curious onlookers. They had taken to screening calls using caller ID and answering machines, desperate to clear their names and move on. Bagden, surprisingly young and dressed sharply in a tailored suit, began without preamble. "I've received final reports from the medical examiner and the police investigation. Based on the evidence, I'm offering a plea deal, 8 to 12 years for second-degree homicide, with eligibility for parole after 8. Claire and Blake were visibly stunned. "We didn't do anything," Claire exclaimed. "How can you even say that?" Blake leaned forward angrily. This is insane. We're innocent. Smith raised a hand, urging calm. Mr. Bagden, with all due respect, could you explain the basis for this offer? Bagden, unfazed by their outbursts, said, we have new evidence. DNA from blood found on Mrs. Holt's car license plate and the trunk gasket matches Jason Holt. Additionally, black polyethylene recovered from under Jason's car matches materials used in Carter landscaping projects. Claire turned to Blake, her voice rising. Blake, what have you done? Blake shot back, you know I didn't do anything. You were with me the whole time. Smith intervened quickly. Stop, he said firmly, turning his attention back to Bagden. Excuse my clients. They had hoped the charges would be dropped, and your statement caught them off guard. Bagden smirked slightly. I understand, but we're ready to go to trial. The medical examiner's findings indicate Mr. Holt's blood loss was catastrophic, and there's no record of him receiving medical treatment anywhere. The crime scene analysis suggests his body was dragged and loaded into a vehicle. We have more than enough to proceed. He handed Smith the updated reports and left. Once Bagden was gone, Claire and Blake turned to their lawyer. This is ridiculous. Claire exclaimed. They're framing us. Quiet, Smith said, his voice low but forceful. You're not helping yourselves by panicking or turning on each other. We need to focus. Do you want to reject the plea deal? Yes, Blake said immediately. We're not guilty. There's no way they can convict us. Claire nodded hesitantly. I'm not taking the deal. Smith sighed. Very well. I'll prepare for trial. After they left his office, Smith reviewed the reports carefully. Despite his growing doubts about his client's innocence, he remained committed to their defense. Months later, the trial began. Judge Robert Cox entered the courtroom promptly at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning. Basil Smith sat between Claire and Blake, attempting to manage their simmering tensions. He had considered advising them to hire separate counsel but knew they couldn't afford it. Blake's business was struggling, and Claire had quit her job, overwhelmed by the stress of the trial and the judgment of Jason's friends and family. District Attorney Jeff Bagden began his opening statement. Members of the jury, while we do not have Jason Holt's body, the evidence will prove that he is deceased and that the defendants are guilty of his murder. Bagden outlined the case methodically. He explained that Jason had discovered his wife's affair with Blake and had filed for divorce. Traces from Jason's computer revealed that he had tracked Claire's movements and documented her meetings with Blake. Jason had also emailed his lawyer, expressing concerns about confronting them. Evidence suggests that on the night of his disappearance, Mr. Holt confronted the defendants at Mr. Carter's residence, Bagden continued. There, he was incapacitated and transported to George Washington Park. At the park, Mr. Holt was shot once in the chest, likely while unconscious. He was then dragged from the vehicle and shot a second time in the neck, severing his carotid artery. As Bagden described these events, graphic crime scene photos were displayed, showing bloodstains and the location of the gunshot wounds. Claire broke down in tears, forcing Judge Cox to call for order. Bagden resumed, detailing how Jason's body was then wrapped in plastic, dragged to Blake's car, and driven to an unknown location for burial. The murder weapon and shovels were discarded in the river, but a Crime Stoppers tip led police to recover them. Forensic analysis links the defendants to the crime scene, Bagden concluded. Jason Holt's blood was found on Mr. Carter's car and on Mrs. Holt's shoes. The defense will attempt to claim they were not at the scene, relying on each other as alibis. I am confident that the evidence will expose the truth and lead you to a verdict of guilty. Basil Smith began his counterarguments, emphasizing the presumption of innocence. The prosecution cannot even prove that Jason Holt is dead, he argued. Without a body, they cannot conclusively establish that my clients committed this crime. Despite his efforts, Bagden's presentation of evidence had left a strong impression. The prosecution's first witness, a computer expert, testified about the emails and tracking data recovered from Jason's computer. The expert explained how the GPS device in Claire's car had logged her visits to Blake's house. The prosecution also presented emails Jason had sent to his lawyer, detailing his suspicions and tracking efforts. The evidence embarrassed Claire, who sat with her head bowed, while Blake appeared bored and disengaged. Smith's cross-examination yielded little, as the digital evidence was airtight. In the gallery, reporters scribbled notes, particularly about the tracking device. They anticipated sensational headlines about the affair, the GPS logs, and the unraveling mystery of Jason Holt's disappearance. After an extended lunch break, the trial resumed with testimony from the emergency operator and 2 patrol officers who had first responded to the scene. They provided straightforward, drama-free accounts of discovering Jason Holt's car in George Washington Park. The trial's tension escalated when detectives and the medical examiner described the crime scene. Large, graphic photographs were presented, showing bullet holes, blood spatters, and drag marks. The medical examiner detailed the extent of blood loss, estimating that Jason had lost 3 to 4 pints, and described arterial blood jets consistent with a severed carotid artery. When the medical examiner concluded that Jason was likely dying at the scene, Claire Holt lost control, crying out, "No, Jason can't be dead." Her emotional outburst forced Judge Cox to adjourn the trial for the rest of the day. The second day began with the medical examiner continuing his testimony, focusing on the blood sample tests. After 15 minutes, District Attorney Jeff Bagdon ended his questioning, and Defense Attorney Basil Smith took over. Smith checked to ensure Claire, now sedated, remained calm. Smith aimed to temper the graphic, execution-like impression of the shooting. "You estimated Jason Holt lost 3 to 4 pints of blood," he began, "but isn't it possible that it was closer to 1 or 2 pints, depending on blood distribution?" The medical examiner hesitated. "It's unlikely, but not impossible," he admitted. Smith followed up, "Could immediate first aid have reduced the fatality of Mr. Holt's injuries?" "Immediate medical attention might have helped," the examiner replied, "but survival was very unlikely." Smith nodded, having planted a seed of doubt. He dismissed the witness after securing these minor concessions. The next witness, a forensic scientist specializing in ballistics, testified about 2 recovered bullets. One was deformed and retrieved from Jason's car seat, while the other, found embedded in firewood, was in good condition. Both matched the recovered weapon. Smith asked, "Were these bullets tested for bone or tissue fragments?" The technician replied, "Minimal blood traces were found on the bullets. Passing through layers of padding and fabric likely cleaned them." He added that the bullets were full metal jacket rounds, often used in military firearms, with a copper-steel gilding metal casing. While this detail didn't directly implicate Claire or Blake, it provided a plausible explanation for the lack of biological evidence on the bullets. Smith confirmed that no fingerprints or DNA from the defendants were found on the weapon or casings, though the technician noted that water exposure and deliberate cleaning likely destroyed any traces. A separate technician testified about the shovels found in the river. While no fingerprints or DNA were recovered, the shovels were branded with the logo of Carter Landscaping. 14 identical shovels were located at Blake's business. Smith's cross-examination yielded little, as the connection to Carter Landscaping was undeniable. Another technician testified about blood evidence found in Claire's car and on her right shoe. While the blood matched Jason's DNA, the technician admitted under cross-examination that it was unclear whether the blood had transferred from the shoe to the gas pedal or vice versa. Smith hoped this ambiguity would cast further doubt. By the end of the prosecution's case, the defense began its presentation, facing skepticism from local newspapers. Commentators speculated that without Jason's body, securing a conviction might be challenging, especially with the defense focusing on creating doubt about whether Jason was truly dead. Basil Smith called blood analysis expert Dr. Wilbur as the first defense witness. Dr. Wilbur criticized the crime scene investigation, stating, a more thorough job could have been done collecting blood evidence. Properly analyzing the blood-soaked soil could have provided a more accurate estimate of blood loss. He further opined that as little as 1.5 pints of blood could have created the scene. Someone losing that much blood could still be alive, he concluded. The district attorney chose not to cross-examine, avoiding unnecessary elaboration of the point. Next, Blake Carter took the stand. Maintaining his innocence, Blake suggested that Jason might have orchestrated his own disappearance. He denied ever owning a firearm and argued that the shovels found in the river could have been stolen from his work sites. Smith kept Blake's testimony brief before turning him over to Bagdon for cross-examination. Bagdon wasted no time. "Mr. Carter, why do you believe Jason Holt would stage his own homicide?" Blake hesitated, then recounted the story of how Jason had threatened him in high school after discovering Blake had secretly dated one of Jason's girlfriends. Bagdon pounced. "So, this isn't the first time you've interfered with Jason Holt's relationships. Isn't it more plausible that if Jason wanted to destroy someone, he would have targeted you rather than himself?" Blake fidgeted under the weight of the question, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Blake Carter couldn't directly answer the prosecutor's pointed question, muttering instead that his physical advantage over Jason would have prevented any confrontation. "So, you think you could intimidate your friend into taking his own life? Is that why you felt comfortable taking his wife?" the prosecutor pressed, not waiting for an answer. "Your actions show you're a narcissist who believes he can have any woman he wants, with no regard for friendship." Basil Smith immediately objected. "Your Honor, the prosecutor is testifying rather than asking questions." Judge Cox agreed and instructed the jury to disregard the prosecutor's last statement. Despite the ruling, Blake was visibly upset as he left the stand without further comment. Basil realized Blake's testimony had backfired but still hoped Claire Holt's testimony might help salvage their case. Claire, more composed than Blake, took the stand and emphatically denied being involved in any attack on her husband. She suggested Jason might have been the victim of a carjacking. Basil, sensing her nervousness, opted not to ask additional questions, leaving her testimony brief. The prosecutor, however, was far less restrained. "Mrs. Holt, where were you between midnight Saturday and 2 p.m. Sunday?" Claire hesitated, visibly embarrassed, before replying, "I was with Blake Carter at his house from 8 p.m. Saturday until about 1:30 p.m. Sunday." "You didn't quite answer the question," the prosecutor said. "Tell us exactly where you were at midnight Saturday." Claire fidgeted before finally admitting, "I was in Blake's bedroom at midnight. We were, doing it." "And how long did this last?" the prosecutor pressed, his tone unrelenting. "Probably until after 1 a.m., Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And then?" "We slept until about 5:45 a.m., she said quickly. "Was Mr. Carter in bed when you woke up?" "Yes, he was there," Claire replied. "We got busy again, and then we went back to sleep around 6:30. We got up around 11 a.m. "So, you woke him up to get busy again at 6:30, the prosecutor clarified. "No, he was already ready," Claire muttered, clearly mortified. The prosecutor paused, letting the jury absorb her answer, then moved in for the final blow. "Mrs. Holt, you claim to love your husband. Is that true?" "Yes," Claire replied emphatically, tears welling in her eyes. "Yet you spent the night with his best friend, engaging in an affair, while he was taking his last breath. How can we believe you weren't involved in his death?" Claire broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Judge Cox, seeing her distress, intervened. "Any further questions?" he asked. When the prosecutor indicated he had none, the judge called for a lunch recess. After Claire composed herself, she joined Basil Smith for a somber lunch. The experienced attorney warned both clients that the case could go either way. Privately, however, he was pessimistic. Both Claire and Blake had faltered on the witness stand, damaging their credibility. The afternoon session ended quickly as Basil announced there were no further witnesses for the defense. Both attorneys spent the evening preparing their closing statements. The prosecutor's closing emphasized the overwhelming evidence against Claire and Blake, including the blood, the weapon, and the shovels. He painted a vivid picture of Jason Holt's final moments, urging the jury to see through the defendant's alibis. In contrast, Basil focused on the circumstantial nature of the case. He stressed the lack of a body, the absence of direct witnesses, and the prosecution's failure to establish a clear motive beyond an affair. By 4 p.m., the jury began deliberations. After 2 hours, they retired for the night without reaching a verdict. The next afternoon, Claire and Blake waited at Basil Smith's office, sharing a conference room in tense silence. By 3:30 p.m., the call came, the jury had reached a verdict. At the courthouse, Claire's parents sat in the gallery, having come to town to support their daughter. The defendants were led to the defense table, their anxiety palpable. The foreperson stood, delivering the verdict, guilty of second-degree homicide. Claire burst into tears, and Blake pounded his fist on the table in frustration. They were handcuffed and led out of the courtroom. Claire had a brief moment to speak to her parents, tearfully proclaiming her innocence before being taken into custody. The week between their conviction and sentencing passed slowly. Claire's parents visited her daily, while Blake received only one visit, from a cousin. At sentencing, both were given 15 years to life. Basil promised to review the trial records for any grounds for appeal. Within 3 days, they were transferred to state prisons. Claire's prison had a reputation for relatively humane conditions, but Blake's facility was infamous for violence and frequent riots. As the trial faded from the public eye, so did Claire Holt and Blake Carter. 2 months later, Basil Smith and Jeff Bagden met for drinks. "I'm still surprised they were convicted," Basil admitted, sipping his whiskey. Their stories were consistent. "I would have bet on reasonable doubt." Bagden shrugged. The jury didn't believe them. That's all it came down to. "Personally, I don't take these cases to heart unless they're particularly heinous or involve children. This wasn't the worst, but it wasn't exactly a case that generated sympathy for the defendants." 18 months later, a news item briefly brought the case back into the spotlight. A riot at Blake Carter's prison left him hospitalized with a collapsed lung after a stabbing. Though listed in serious condition, he was expected to survive. 18 months after Claire and Blake's convictions, Basil Smith rarely thought about the case. He had spent the first year reviewing transcripts but found no legal grounds for appeal. One quiet Wednesday morning, a FedEx package arrived at the New York office of the Innocence Project. Inside the package were a DVD, a sealed biohazard bag, and a multi-page letter. Intrigued, the receptionist called Tony Kelly, a young attorney with the Innocence Project, to take a look. Tony, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, carried the package to his office. He had been with the organization for a year, primarily conducting legal research. He relished the opportunity to help those who had been wrongfully convicted. Settling at his desk, Tony opened the letter first. The typed pages began. "Regarding the convictions of Claire Holt and Blake Carter, I don't know where to start, so I'll begin at the beginning. My name isn't important, but the information I have could change the lives of the 2 convicted and 5 others, including me." Tony leaned forward, captivated, and continued reading. The letter unfolded the story of a man, calling himself Mark, who had started working for the anonymous author approximately 15 months earlier. When Mark arrived in town, he hadn't yet rented a place. "My business was new, and I rented him a basement room for extra income. I wanted to reinvest profits into the business to support myself and my young son. Something about Mark made me trust him, I sensed no threat. He quickly became indispensable. His skills in business networking expanded my client base by 50% in just 2 months. Mark worked tirelessly, preferring productivity over television or sleep. He lived in the basement for the first 3 months but joined my son and me for meals and commutes. Over time, our relationship evolved. From employer and employee, we became friends. Then, to my surprise, we became a family. My son even began calling him Dad. Still, I could tell Mark carried a heavy burden. One afternoon, I locked the office door and asked him directly what was troubling him. At first, he avoided the question, but eventually, he confessed. He was running from a failed marriage. His wife, he said, had betrayed him with his best friend. The pain of their betrayal had driven him to the brink of destroying them, and himself. That day marked a turning point for Mark. He began to heal. We started dating, and within a month, he moved from the basement to my bedroom. But even then, I sensed there was more to his story. The letter went on to explain how, for days earlier, Mark had collapsed at work and was rushed to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with a heart condition requiring surgery. As he recovered, he shared his full story with the author, who promised to document it and send it to the Innocence Project in case something happened to him during surgery. The letter recounted the chilling details of Mark's downward spiral 2 years earlier. Mark had been married to Claire for nearly 6 years when he noticed a bruise on her right side. At first, he dismissed it as an accident, but the shape resembled a love bite. Troubled, he couldn't let it go. The next day, a delivery manager showed him a tracking device to evaluate for improving their delivery service. Mark decided to test it, on Claire's car. 3 days later, he checked the monitor. Claire had claimed she was shopping, but the tracker showed she was at Blake Carter's house. Her car stayed there for over an hour. Mark called her, and when she repeated her shopping lie, he knew she was being unfaithful. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he observed her for another week. While on a business trip, he tracked her car as it went to Blake's house again, staying from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. She later lied about being home that entire night. The confirmation of her betrayal devastated him. Mark decided to confront her and Blake, but with deadly consequences. He borrowed a revolver from an elderly neighbor's late husband's toolbox, intending to kill them both before taking his own life. But Mark hesitated. During the week it took for Claire and Blake to meet again, he reconsidered. Instead of ending their lives, he devised a plan to frame them for his own murder. Tony set the letter down, his stomach twisting. He glanced at the sealed biohazard bag containing what appeared to be fragments of fabric and a small piece of paper, then slid the DVD into his laptop. The video opened with a man sitting in a modest room, pale and visibly weakened. His voice was steady but tired. "My name is Mark Holt. I'm alive, but I shouldn't be. I've been hiding for almost 2 years, and it's time the truth comes out. Claire and Blake didn't kill me, but I made it look like they did." Mark detailed his actions. He had staged his car to appear like the scene of a violent crime. Using animal blood purchased from a butcher, he created drag marks and blood spatter at George Washington Park. He fired 2 shots into the car and nearby firewood, using gloves to prevent leaving fingerprints. He then dumped the weapon and shovels in the river, knowing they would trace back to Blake's business. The tracking data he'd collected was forwarded to his attorney, Robert Graham, before he disappeared. Finally, Mark withdrew money from their joint account, ensuring Claire would face financial hardship. "I wanted them to pay for what they did," Mark admitted, his voice breaking. "But I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't think it would go this far." The video ended with Mark's plea: "Claire and Blake may not be innocent of betrayal, but they didn't commit murder. I can't let them spend their lives in prison for a crime I invented." Tony sat back, stunned. The package contained everything needed to reopen the case: the confession, physical evidence, and documentation of Mark's plan. He immediately called his supervisor, who arrived within minutes. Together, they began planning the next steps to clear Claire and Blake's names, and to track down Mark Holt. When ready, Jason Holt claimed he was leaving for a weekend business trip, knowing that Claire and Blake would likely meet while he was away. As his wife went to Blake's house, Jason set his plan into motion, carefully creating a paper trail to suggest he was divorcing her. He almost forgot to send a crucial email to his lawyer that would implicate Claire and Blake but remembered at the last moment. Before leaving, he fired a bullet into the passenger seat of his car and another into a piece of firewood. To muffle the sound, he wrapped the revolver in a thick blanket and shot it in the garage. This final step brought him an odd sense of relief. It marked the official start of his revenge. Jason drove his car to a park near Blake's house late that night, finding a secluded spot. Carrying a large gym bag filled with the materials he had prepared, he set up his fake crime scene. Using an old blanket to conceal his actions, he unloaded firewood, plastic sheeting, and a spare tire. He dragged the tire to create a trail leading from the car to the paved road, then returned it to the trunk and scattered the firewood around. Working methodically under the beam of a small flashlight, Jason tested whether anyone might notice him, sitting quietly for several minutes before continuing. He then used a needle to draw nearly 2 pints of his own blood, diluting it with distilled water. Carefully, he sprayed patterns of the blood on the ground and in the car to mimic arterial spatter. He smeared more on the seat and ground to suggest significant blood loss, adding it to the bullet holes in the car upholstery and firewood for extra effect. Once finished, Jason packed his supplies back into the gym bag and left the park. He reached a cheap car he had purchased for this purpose and rested there until dawn, dizzy from the blood loss. By 6 a.m., he drove to Blake's house to finalize his plan. Claire's car was still parked outside Blake's house, and Jason found it unlocked. He placed a few drops of his blood on the gas pedal and smeared more on the exterior of Blake's car. However, he noticed a light turn on in Blake's bedroom and quickly left. Jason drove to a payphone and used a voice changer to call in a tip, pretending to be a woman reporting a suspicious car in the park. He later disposed of the revolver and 2 shovels in the river. Exhausted, he checked into a motel for 2 days, relying on supplements and energy bars to recover. From the same motel, he made another call with the voice changer, this time pretending to be an older man. The second call helped police locate the weapon. The letter continued. Jason told me this story in its entirety because he wants to leave his identity as Jason Holt behind. He now lives under a different name, which my son and I use, and he wishes to keep it that way. Tomorrow, I'll prepare a page from the New York Times with Jason's fingerprints in a bloodstain. This, combined with his DNA, will prove he's alive and exonerate Claire Holt and Blake Carter. Jason's surgery went well, and we're expecting twins in a few months. I hope this package will be enough to correct the injustice done to them. Tony Kelly finished reading, his mind racing. He checked the remaining items in the package, a DVD labeled photos taken in George Washington Park and a biohazard bag marked fingerprints and DNA. Tony immediately contacted a senior attorney at the Innocence Project, knowing this case was beyond his experience alone. It didn't take long for the evidence to confirm the truth. DNA from the blood at the park matched Jason Holt, and his fingerprints on the newspaper page were an exact match for those found on his car. The revelations were undeniable. Jason was alive, and Claire and Blake had been wrongfully convicted. The state attorney general and governor expedited the process to secure their release. Within a week, Claire and Blake returned to the courtroom with their attorney, Basil Smith, as well as Claire's parents and District Attorney Jeff Bagden. In a formal statement, the state attorney general apologized for the wrongful convictions. Jason Holt's actions misled the justice system, he said, and efforts are underway to locate him and hold him accountable for the financial and legal costs incurred. When asked where the search for Jason would begin, the Attorney General admitted there were no immediate leads. Blake Carter appeared subdued, a shadow of his former self. He offered Claire a quiet apology for the choices that had led to their imprisonment. "I'm sorry for everything," he said. Claire, drained from the ordeal, barely responded. She seemed eager to leave with her parents and put the entire ordeal behind her. Both Basil Smith and Jeff Bagden expressed regret for their roles in the case. "We were misled," Bagden admitted. "I'll be more diligent in future cases." While the state disclaimed liability, both Claire and Blake received $50,000 each as compensation. Blake, whose business had gone bankrupt and whose home had been sold to cover legal fees, decided to leave town. Before departing, he remarked to Claire, "Jason ruined us both. 50 grand doesn't even begin to cover it." Claire, visibly worn, replied flatly, "We deserved it," before walking away without saying goodbye. 2 weeks after cable news reported their release, a large envelope arrived at Basil Smith's office. Inside was a note addressed to the attorney and a sealed envelope marked for Claire Holt. Basil drove to Claire's apartment to deliver the letter personally. They exchanged a few brief words. Claire looked tired but thanked him quietly, before he left her alone with the envelope. With trembling hands, Claire opened it and immediately recognized Jason's handwriting. Taking a deep breath, she began to read. "Claire. I'm sorry for the time you spent in prison. Your betrayal with Blake nearly destroyed me. It drove me to a place I never thought I could go, but my new life and the happiness I've found have taught me something important. Freeing you and Blake was necessary for my own freedom. I know the authorities will search for me, but I'm confident in the life I've built with my new family. Please don't try to find me. Good luck and goodbye. J." The letter slipped from Claire's hand and floated to the floor. Any lingering hope of reconciliation with Jason dissolved as she stared at the paper. The finality of his words, the mention of his new family, cut deeper than she expected. Her betrayal and Jason's calculated revenge had left her life in ruins, and now, with this letter, she realized there was no going back.